Welcome back, everyone, to the most intense, brutal, and merciless developments on the global geopolitical chessboard, right here on U.S. Strategic Insight. In the blood soaked encyclopedia of human warfare, there is one ruthless truth that those drunk on peak power often deliberately ignore. When a great Eastern power agrees to sit at the negotiating table under the barrel of your gun, it is rarely surrendered. It is the perfect art of buying time, forging lethal blades while waiting for that single blink from you to strike straight at the throat. Today, all of humanity has been violently awakened from the sleepwalk of a fake peace. We have become silent witnesses to the greatest naval tragedy since World War II, a moment when the ultimate arrogance of peace through strength was shattered and sunk into the black waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The geopolitical negotiating table, where Washington believed it would force total submission, was not only overturned, it was burned to ashes in a raging inferno. 127 American supercarriers and warships, an unprecedented armada carrying the lifeblood and absolute pride of the empire, suddenly turned into 127 floating coffins, writhing in a deadly kill zone called the Strait of Hormuz. The one who swung the hammer of fate to slam shut the gates of life and death was the cold, calculating minds hidden deep in the underground bunkers beneath the Zagros Mountains. Let us turn the lens back to Washington, D.C., just 24 hours before the waters of the Gulf became a slaughterhouse. Inside the Oval Office, the air was thick with smugness and ironclad confidence in a bloodless victory. President Trump and his hawkish team believed they held the golden hand by mobilizing the largest naval force in modern history: three nuclear carrier strike groups, dozens of Ticonderoga-class cruisers, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the most advanced Aegis systems, nuclear attack submarines, and amphibious ships. A total of 127 massive war machines funneled into the choke point. The Pentagon called it maximum stranglehold, a moving steel wall dozens of nautical miles long meant to lock down the world's energy jugular, choke Iran's economy, and force Tehran into an unconditional, humiliating surrender treaty. America was convinced that the glow from thousands of Tomahawk missile tubes aimed at Iran's coast was absolute language of intimidation. They looked at intelligence reports of Iran's struggling economy under sanctions and deluded themselves that the ticking clock at the negotiating table was counting down to regime collapse. Overly confident in raw muscle and trade bargaining tricks, Washington naively crammed its entire steel wolf pack into a narrow bathtub, voluntarily stripping away the critical maneuverability advantage of a modern navy. But history always reserves the harshest punishments for arrogance. While American diplomats lounged in Geneva waiting for the Iranian delegation to sign the surrender document in another dimension under the rugged, sunset stained cliffs of the Middle East, a colossal asymmetric war machine had quietly locked onto its targets. The top commanders of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, did not break a sweat facing 127 American supercarriers. In the eyes of Tehran's strategists, backed by underground intelligence and technical support from the Moscow-Beijing axis, the massive U.S. fleet was not an unbeatable pack of predators. It was a fat, static tumor, a flock of sitting ducks crammed too tightly into a strait whose narrowest point is less than 39 kilometers wide. Iran had used the negotiations themselves as the perfect anesthetic, a masterpiece of strategic deception. Their feigned concessions and willingness to prolong talks were only to give Eastern allies satellite positioning systems enough time to paint a matrix of death coordinates, locking onto every square millimeter of the 127 American ships. America was not encircling Iran. America had willingly stuck its own neck into a noose tightened by the art of storm warfare. The decisive moment did not come with an American ultimatum on television, but with a silence so icy it froze the blood. At the negotiating table, the head of the Iranian delegation glanced at his watch, the corner of his mouth curling into a faint, soulless smile. Without saying a word, he stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the room, leaving America's list of demands lying abandoned on the table. The instant the meeting room door slammed shut, a ultra-short, quantum-encoded order was transmitted from a command bunker 500 meters deep under the mountains. The order did not call for infantry deployment, it activated Judgment Day for metal. The first blow did not come from missiles or guns, but descended from the ionosphere. An eerie silence suddenly engulfed the entire 127 ship American armada plowing through the strait. The world's most powerful, active, electronically scanned array radars screamed alarms before every screen turned to gray static. Russian Krasuka and similar electronic warfare monsters, secretly deployed by Iran along the coast, roared to life and unleashed deadly high-intensity electromagnetic waves. In just 5 seconds, the entire satellite communications, tactical data links, and command and control networks of the 127 warships were shattered. Their eyes were gouged out, their ears sealed shut. The $13 billion aircraft carriers became deaf and mute steel islands drifting helplessly. The pride of Western military technology was stripped away in the blink of an eye. Admirals covered in metal stood frozen in the combat information centers, sweating bullets as they realized they could not even contact a destroyer escort a few hundred meters away, let alone call back to the Pentagon. The giant mousetrap in Hormuz had officially snapped shut, but blindness was only the overture to the symphony of death. As panic began tearing at the nerves of tens of thousands of U.S. Marines, the eastern sky suddenly lit up with thousands of blood-red streaks, not natural thunder, but the savage roar of hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile Zolfagar, 110S, and other systems hidden in underground cave networks along the coast. The sky over Hormuz was torn apart by a merciless meteor shower. Thousands of metal blocks carrying kinetic energy equivalent to hundreds of tons of TNT hurtled down at 5 times the speed of sound. Simultaneously, from sea-skimming altitude, swarms of tens of thousands of new generation Shahed suicide drones flew low, creating a thick black carpet racing toward the supercarriers. The Eastern doctrine of asymmetric warfare had reached perfection, using overwhelming numbers to clog and collapse the most advanced defense systems. America's Aegis air defense, once the untouchable pride of deterrence, now spun helplessly in a futile dance. Without long-range radar support, the Phalanx CIWS system screamed and spat endless streams of fire into the night, desperately trying to swat away the swarm of killer bees. But human endurance and ammunition are finite against a deluge of fire. The first hypersonic missile punched through the defense grid and slammed into the flight deck of the lead Nimitz-class supercarrier. An earth-shaking explosion rang out. A massive, vicious fireball swallowed F-35Cs that never got airborne, ripping through reinforced alloy steel like paper. Shockwaves shattered the island's superstructure and hurled dozens of sailors into boiling seas. And that was only the first drop in a cataclysmic flood. The scene in the Strait of Hormuz had long surpassed a mere naval battle. It had become a colossal mechanical slaughterhouse. Dozens of proud destroyers were rammed by suicide drones that detonated their ammunition magazines. The waters of the Gulf were no longer water. They became a rust-red soup of burning oil and thick black smoke. The 127 warships, trapped in overly dense formation, turned into giant obstacles, colliding with each other in desperate, futile escape attempts. Blinded by electronic warfare and unable to maneuver in the narrow strait, the sea giants could only lie helpless and endure the merciless judgment from Iran's barren mountains. The undefeatable empire's faith was literally torn apart into millions of pieces drifting in the bloody Gulf. The shock waves of this annihilating strike raced through undersea fiber optic cables and slammed into the underground Situation Room in Washington like an invisible scythe across the throat of America's elite. President Trump and his team, who had been raising glasses minutes earlier expecting enemy surrender, now stared into a nightmare beyond imagination. Panoramic screens showed only blood-red static. We are losing the entire 127 warships. The operations chief's scream tore through the silence as psychological pressure crashed down like a collapsing mountain. Flipping the negotiating table was never the act of the week. It was the opening shot of a cold geopolitical surgery to excise Western hegemony from the Asian European continent. America was backed into a corner with no escape. Watch a century of naval glory burn to dust, or press the nuclear button and drag the world into the abyss. But the ruthlessness of Eastern warfare did not stop at sinking steel giants. While the Hormuz waters burned fiercely, and tens of thousands of American lives hung between life and death, the real storm was only beginning. The surface of the Gulf had become a giant cauldron of boiling oil in the infernal furnace of hell. No more heroic epics about an invincible navy. No more propaganda about the global security umbrella. Only the acrid stench of burning titanium alloy, the sharp smell of tens of thousands of tons of JP-5 jet fuel, and the throat-tearing screams of tens of thousands of U.S. Marines abandoned in a sea of flames. The 100,000-ton Nimitz-class supercarrier, the heart of the fleet, groaned ghostly as dozens of hypersonic ballistic missiles tore through its reinforced double hull. The vaunted armor that Pentagon engineers once boasted about proved as thin as paper against the insane penetrating power of Eastern hypersonic weapons. The ship listed heavily, flinging $100 million A-18 Super Hornets and F-35Cs into the sea like broken toys. Thousands of young Americans, once filled with the absolute pride of a superpower, now struggled desperately in waters mixed with burning oil, waiting for a rescue that would never come. This was not a random accident. It was a calculated death sentence pronounced by the fatal arrogance and systemic miscalculations of the Western military elite. They deluded themselves that deploying these giant floating fortresses anywhere would force weaker nations to their knees. But Washington's arrogance reached blindness when it applied open ocean warfare doctrine to a deadly narrow kill box like the Strait of Hormuz, funneling 127 massive, cumbersome warships into an area where shore-to-target distances were measured in mere dozens of miles was a classic strategic suicide. They had locked their own eagles in an iron cage, turning firepower superiority into a static giant tumor on the geopolitical board designed by Tehran's strategists. With comprehensive technological support from Moscow and Beijing, the A2AD anti-access area denial doctrine had reached perfection. Iran did not need aircraft carriers to confront America. It turned its entire jagged, mountainous coastline into an unsinkable missile launching platform. By combining blinding electronic warfare against satellites, swarms of suicide drones to exhaust air defenses, and hypersonic ballistic missiles as the decisive strike, the East officially declared the end of the carrier era. The arrogance of the Pentagon had to be paid for in blood when they realized that in the age of hypersonic weapons and asymmetric warfare, multi-billion-dollar ships were nothing more than expensive, slow-moving targets. While flames in Hormuz melted the last remnants of the fleet, thousands of miles away in the underground Situation Room in Washington, the atmosphere thickened into acid, eating away at the limits of human reason. The self importance, arrogance, and fire and fury threats that President Trump had once brandished in the media now turned into horrified, humiliating silence. Under the dim glow of flickering monitors, the commander in chief of the planet's most powerful military buried his face in trembling hands. Four-star generals covered in medals stood frozen, cold sweat pouring down. They could not believe what their own eyes were seeing. Encrypted channels poured in casualty reports that froze the blood. No large-scale evacuation was possible. Every rescue helicopter that took off from nearby bases was immediately targeted by Iranian man-portable air defenses and drone swarms exploding into fireballs in the sky. Panic crept into every neuron of the leadership machine. Helplessness, suffocation, and bitterness crushed the pride of the elite. This was not Pearl Harbor. This was a meticulously calculated humiliation designed to shame America's superpower status before the eyes of the world. Cornered, the wounded pride of a superpower drove the Pentagon to launch desperate, frenzied counterattacks. Emergency counterattack orders were shouted over unjammed hotlines. From Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, squadrons of B-52 strategic bombers and F-22 Raptor stealth fighters scrambled with thousands of tons of smart bombs and cruise missiles, aiming to flatten the IRGC's underground networks. Washington wanted blood to wash away the shame and use absolute air power to flip the board, but they once again fell into the pit of illusion. The moment those giant bombers entered the edge of Hormuz airspace, Iran's previously quiet air defense curtain revealed its true fangs. Not only domestic Bavar 373 systems, but the most advanced S-400 Triumph complexes secretly transferred by Russia months earlier activated their fire control radars. Long white smoke trails tore through the night sky with terrifying precision. American pilots, who had always believed stealth technology was an absolute invisibility cloak, were horrified as radar warning receivers screamed. The enemy's electronic warfare was too strong, distorting GPS coordinates and neutralizing all jamming attempts. One after another, fighters and bombers exploded into falling sparks over the desert. The skies of the Middle East were now a no-fly zone for American air power. The failed counterstrike brutally exposed the truth. The American empire had truly lost its ability to intervene with conventional force. The earthquake from the collapse of U.S. military posture in Hormuz immediately tore open the fragile security shell of the entire Middle East, creating a geopolitical tsunami that overturned every power foundation. In Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and especially Tel Aviv, confidence in Washington's steel umbrella shattered into a million shards. Witnessing the effortless sinking of America's 127 ship fleet and the humiliating failure of retaliatory airstrikes, Arab states and Israel fell into absolute terror. They realized a bone-chilling truth. If America, with all its technological and military might, could be massacred by the Moscow-Tehran-Beijing axis without being able to defend itself, then the survival of these allied nations could no longer rely on blind loyalty to Washington. Instinct for self-preservation replaced decades of allegiance. That very night, secret diplomatic channels in the Middle East went into overdrive, not to beg Washington for help, but to establish hotlines with the Kremlin and Beijing. Defense pacts with America were quietly shelved in favor of desperate attempts to appease the Eurasian axis. The regional order was not merely shifting, it was being completely inverted. America, once the dispenser of security and decider of Middle East fates, was pushed to the margins, becoming a fading ghost abandoned even by its closest allies out of fear of association. As hawks in the Pentagon began screaming for tactical nuclear options to salvage the game, another piercing alarm shattered the last remnants of reason. This time, the signal did not come from the bloody Middle East. It came from U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. Early warning radars across the entire forward island chain suddenly suffered massive jamming. Optical satellites detected unprecedented massive movements of Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy destroyers, carriers, and amphibious forces heading straight for the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. At the same time, Russian nuclear strategic submarines vanished from tracking screens in the Arctic. An eerie silence enveloped American command centers. Washington realized in shock that the Hormuz trap was not an isolated event. It was the opening shot of a perfectly coordinated global decapitation campaign by the three Eastern superpowers. While the American eagle bled and lay paralyzed in the Gulf, the Dragon and Bear had officially opened the next fronts. The second gate of hell was slowly opening. America's entire global defense system now faced an irreversible deluge. The thick black smoke columns reeking of death and burning oil rising from the blood-soaked Gulf did not merely blot out the Middle Eastern sun, they officially drew a dark curtain over the entire Western-dominated world order. In the total warfare art of the multipolar era, crushing a supercarrier fleet on the physical battlefield was only the visible tip of a vast iceberg. The Moscow-Beijing-Tehran axis did not pour everything into this trap of the century merely to trade for a few tens of thousands of American lives or piles of scrap metal. Their supreme objective was a root and branch geopolitical surgery, severing the petrodollar system, cutting the energy lifeline of Western civilization, and completely shattering the belief system sustaining the American empire. Just minutes after the Pentagon silently admitted the disappearance of 127 warships, commercial optical reconnaissance and open source intelligence systems transmitted a message that froze the blood of every tycoon from New York to Tokyo. The Strait of Hormuz, the jugular carrying over one-third of the world's oil, had been sealed shut with a red-hot iron coffin lid. Hundreds of Bastion and Zolfagar hypersonic anti-ship missile batteries had risen from underground caves in the Zagros Mountains, aiming their black muzzles at the planet's busiest shipping lane. The waters were not only littered with American wrecks, but sealed by smart minefields and roaming suicide drone swarms. No further shots were needed. The mere presence of this deadly fire net, combined with the fleet's corpses, turned the area into an absolute no-go zone. Hundreds of giant Western-flagged VLCC supertankers waiting to drink the Earth's black blood suddenly panicked, turned around, and fled, risking collisions in the dark to escape the closing trap. The sight of these maritime commercial giants fleeing in panic before the shadow of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was the most naked portrait of the collapse of so-called freedom of navigation that America had boasted. About for a century, when the black blood feeding Western industrial machines and warming cities was suddenly cut off, a savage financial tsunami began, swallowing every effort by central banks to intervene. On the New York Stock Exchange floor, the opening bell did not ring as the dawn of capitalism, but as a death knell. The Dow, Nasdaq, and S&P 500 did not fluctuate. They plunged like lead weights into the abyss. Algorithmic sell orders, triggered at millions of transactions per second, created an unstoppable panic waterfall. Electronic boards drowned in deep blood red. Brent crude prices shattered every record, exploding past $200, then $300 per barrel. Brokers in $1,000 suits stood stunned on the trading floor with empty, despairing eyes. The idea of printing money to rescue the system became a pathetic joke. You cannot print money to buy something that no longer exists for sale. In helpless rage, Washington drew its last economic sword, the SWIFT payment system and total sanctions. From the Oval Office, President Trump frantically signed executive orders freezing all Russian, Chinese, and Iranian assets and threatening any entity that dared trade with this axis of evil. The Pentagon and U.S. Treasury still arrogantly believed that even if they lost on the battlefield, they remained lords of money. But that arrogance blinded them to a terrifying reality prepared for over a decade. The moment U.S. sanctions were announced, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran responded with contemptuous silence. That same day, the BRICS bloc officially activated its independent international payment system, expanded from SIPS and SPFS, fully backed by gold, oil, and rare metals. They used the very paradox of the market to turn the US dollar into worthless paper. Western nations realized in horror that their money was meaningless when it could not buy a single drop of oil for the coming winter or power their hollowed out factories. The supreme foundation of American power, the ability to export inflation and make the world carry its debt, had been ruthlessly severed by the Eurasian alliance right at humanity's oil heart. Alongside the economic collapse, a brutal cognitive massacre was underway, shaking the psychological and social fabric of America to its core. The giant Western propaganda machine, once capable of distorting reality in Iraq or Yugoslavia, was now completely powerless to cover up the tragedy of 127 lost warships in a razor-sharp information warfare move. Russian and Iranian intelligence hackers breached Pentagon servers, stole raw, unedited footage from ship security cameras and helmet cams of Marines burning alive, and released them directly onto social media platforms beyond Washington's control. Hundreds of millions of Americans woke up to phones flashing with scenes of their compatriots' elite young soldiers screaming as they fled through seas of fire, desperately fighting flames before being incinerated by drone swarms, and proud capital ships breaking in half and sinking. Those were not just videos. They were sugar-coated bullets piercing the false shell of invulnerability of a society that always considered itself untouchable. Vietnam syndrome, 9/11 trauma, and the humiliating ghost of Kabul were multiplied thousands of times. Public pressure crushed the corridors of power like a 1,000-ton rock. Fury erupted into a giant powder keg. Millions poured into the streets from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, not peaceful marches, but fiery riots in the night. They demanded the president's removal, and the hawkish generals court-martialed for sending their children into a slaughterhouse with no exit. The American elite suddenly found themselves caught between two deadly vices: advance and face total military annihilation, or retreat and watch the empire collapse from within due to its own people's rage. The shockwaves quickly tore apart Washington's seemingly rock-solid alliances. Across the Atlantic, aging Europe plunged into herd-like panic. NATO leaders who had obediently followed America yesterday now trembled at the prospect of an ice-cold economic winter and total industrial paralysis. With the Middle East energy lifeline severed and America's protection umbrella proven to be tissue paper, promises of solidarity with Washington became worthless and hypocritical. In the darkness of desperation and survival instinct, secret diplomatic channels activated at full capacity. Leaders of pillars like France, Germany, and Italy quickly understood a sharp truth. They were mere expendable pawns, meat buffers on America's grand chessboard. If they continued blindly clinging to the sinking unipolar ship, all of European civilization would be dragged into the abyss. Within 48 hours of the Hormuz catastrophe, Secret flights without civilian transponders took off from Paris and Berlin, not heading west across the Atlantic, but quietly crossing neutral airspace to knock on the doors of the Kremlin and Beijing. In cold, closed rooms, Europe hastily offered humiliating secret deals, unilateral lifting of sanctions, refusal of further logistical support to remaining U.S. forces, and payments in rubles or yuan, anything to keep a sliver of survival from the Russian bear and Chinese dragon. The Western alliance, the greatest pride of Pentagon diplomacy, was cracking, rotting, and melting like wax before the roaring Eastern geopolitical fire. Betrayal did not come through gunfire, but through cold silence when Washington called for help. But everything had already spiraled far beyond the control of America's elite. The United States stood trapped in a perfectly closed 8 trigram formation, paralyzed militarily, financially collapsed, its people in fury, and betrayed by its oldest allies. Yet the most horrifying truth, the deepest, most insidious final blow from the East, was not oil or carriers. It struck at the very foundation of Washington's war machine as the Pentagon frantically ordered Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing to restart production lines around the clock to replace the destroyed fleet. A top secret report landed on the president's desk carrying the quietest death sentence. Beijing had just announced a permanent 100% ban on exports of rare earths for semiconductors and critical refined minerals to America and its vassals. The entire global physical supply chain froze. American weapons factories suddenly realized they lacked materials to build even a single missile guidance system or tank armor. The great American military industrial machine had its plug pulled. The world had never seen such suffocation. America was not only isolated, it was being starved of oxygen, turned into a giant island dying for raw materials on its own continent. But when despair reached its peak and the leader's eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness and fear, an even more vicious blow landed. On NORAD's screens, unexplained voltage drops swept across the East Coast. The national power grid, communications, and Pentagon servers began flickering eerily. It was no accident. It was a sophisticated quantum malware virus, dormant for years, now awakened by Eastern Command. The enemy had reached straight into America's throat. A flashing red warning appeared. The nuclear command and control system was under external interference. The final protective door guarding America was being forced open. A suffocating silence filled the bunker as true darkness prepared to descend on 300 million people. The chaos inside the Situation Room exploded into collective madness. The air reeked of cold sweat and primal fear. President Trump, once the master of madman theory, sat stunned, eyes fixed on the open nuclear football now flashing broken code. Four-star generals screamed at each other in spittle-flying arguments. Hardliners demanded immediate nuclear strikes, use it or lose it. Veteran officers slammed the table in fury. Any launch now would be national suicide. The Eastern powers had turned the nuclear button into a perfect psychological trap. If America fired, Russia's S-500 and China's intercept systems would neutralize the strikes, only to unleash an apocalyptic retaliation that would wipe North America off the map in under 30 minutes. The stench of doomsday hung thick in the bunker. While futile arguments raged underground, the cyber attack flooded into civilian infrastructure. The power grids of New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, and Chicago collapsed in cascading explosions. The night skies of America's brightest cities went pitch black. Transportation froze. Intersections became slaughterhouses as vehicles crashed in total darkness. Phones, internet, and lights died. Tens of millions of Americans, already traumatized by the Hormuz disaster, were hurled back into the Stone Age. ATMs froze, credit cards became useless, supermarkets turned into battlegrounds. Gunfire echoed from Brooklyn to Queens as desperate citizens fought for food, water, and survival. Police and National Guard abandoned their posts to protect their own families. The land of dreams was devouring itself in a blood-soaked, real-life purge. The empire was not just defeated abroad, it was being incinerated from within. The empire had not only been defeated in Hormuz, it was being incinerated from within by the chaos and total loss of faith in a helplessly impotent government. America's internal disintegration was broadcast live to the world via the few remaining satellites, creating a shock that completely fractured the global geopolitical structure. Remaining U.S. allies, who had been holding their breath for a Pentagon miracle, now watched the world's number one power convulse in anarchy. A cold, absolute silence of abandonment spread from London to Tokyo. The idea of America-led free world was dead. No nation dared send rescue ships. No leader dared voice support. America was completely isolated, blockaded, and abandoned like a highly contagious patient. The old world order was fracturing at terrifying speed. Military alliances crumbled like autumn leaves. Meanwhile, in Beijing and Moscow, military command centers observed their rivals collapse with deadly calm. They continued tightening the economic and military vice, refusing all third-party diplomatic calls. They no longer needed to negotiate, they were waiting for the beast to bleed itself dry. The psychological breaking point in the Oval Office had been surpassed. As President Trump, face ashen and eyes vacant, abandoned hope in the nuclear option and ordered remaining fleets to fortify the North American continent, a piercing alarm tore through NORAD's emergency acoustic warning system. This was no network glitch. It was a pure physical warning. Even with heavy jamming, the underwater SOSUS network in the North Atlantic detected an extreme anomaly moving at unimaginable speed. A massive information void suddenly appeared right off the East Coast. Seabed sensors reported giant stealth objects with the acoustic signature of latest generation nuclear reactors surfacing from the black depths. Less than 150 nautical miles from New York and Naval Station Norfolk, the Moscow-Beijing-Tehran axis had not only defended, not only destroyed the 127 ship fleet, not only collapsed the economy and domestic power grid, through a secret campaign of unimaginable scale, they had stealthily brought the scythe of death across vast oceans, under Arctic ice and Atlantic depths, now looming right at America's doorstep. The judgment was no longer abstract in cyberspace. It had materialized as black steel behemoths bristling with nuclear venom pressed against the temple of the North American continent. The third gate of hell had officially swung wide open. The moment deciding the empire's fate was now measured in seconds. For 2.5 centuries since its founding, America had deluded itself with a blind geographic religion that two giant oceans were eternal natural walls, a divine shield making the North American fortress immune to war. Tonight, that great illusion was torn to shreds. The appearance of Russian Bore class and Chinese Type 096 nuclear strategic submarines less than 150 nautical miles from the Statue of Liberty and Manhattan was the final surgical thrust into the throat of Western power. They did not need to fire. Their mere silent presence, carrying hundreds of MIRV warheads and Poseidon doomsday torpedoes right under America's armpit, was a slap that shattered the Pentagon's nuclear deterrence system. The 150 nautical mile distance reduced NORAD's early warning from 30 minutes to under 3 minutes. America had no time to react, no space to breathe, and no standing to make demands. For the first time in modern history, the greatest hunter had become a hostage in its own home. The earthquake from this checkmate created a chain reaction across the global chessboard, forcing every nation into a bloody life or death choice of sides. Europe's betrayal exploded beyond secret deals into the most shameful rout in alliance history. Seeing that America could not even protect itself from Russian and Chinese spears, NATO pillars like France, Germany, and Italy publicly dropped the mask. They activated open hotlines to the Kremlin and Beijing, unilaterally suspended treaties, froze U.S. bases, and declared unconditional neutrality. They begged for energy security guarantees and rushed to offer market access and technology deals to the Eurasian axis in exchange for being spared from nuclear target lists. The century-old Western alliance structure had completely collapsed from within, not by explosives, but by the rot of lost faith in a truly fallen empire. In the Pacific, Beijing's second pincer closed with unstoppable speed and force. Exploiting America's blindness and paralysis, the PLA realized its territorial dream without conventional resistance. Thousands of warships, landing ships, and armed drone swarms crossed the Taiwan Strait as if no one was there. The island's defenses, totally reliant on U.S. GPS and Link 16, were completely blinded by electronic warfare. No Seventh Fleet came to the rescue. No F-35S from Okinawa provided cover. Massive U.S. bases in Japan and South Korea fell into total isolation. Surrounded by an electromagnetic iron curtain, they became deserted islands awaiting the storm. Tokyo and Seoul, realizing the American nuclear umbrella had vanished, swallowed their tears and sent envoys to Beijing that very night to sign comprehensive non-aggression treaties, turning remaining U.S. forces in Asia into abandoned hostages. The domino effect spread to the global south. BRICS plus nations and non-aligned countries watched with cold resolve the 127 ship annihilation and compromised U.S. Nuclear command proved Western paper tigers were finished. A wave of stripping American power swept across. Nations expelled U.S. military missions, nationalized Western-controlled resources, and declared USD debts null. The flight from the petrodollar became a stampede. At global financial centers, the dollar was dumped for gold and multipolar digital currencies. Real power had officially transferred to those willing to play the deadly game with cold patience, waiting for the prey to walk into the trap. The world did not overthrow America. It surgically excised America from humanity's circulation. Back in the underground bunker, the crisis of faith had corroded the military machine's core. The president's loss of nuclear control caused bloody fractures in the chain of command. Generals who once swore loyalty now doubted each other. When the White House ordered the National Guard to fire on rioting civilians in New York, many commanders refused. Military disobedience spread like cancer. A micro-civil war was erupting while foreign enemies held a knife to the nation's throat. America was digging its own grave with long-suppressed hatred and division. The Situation Room was suffocating. President Trump, hair disheveled and face twisted in fear, stared blankly at the jammed screens. Every attempt to save the empire had failed. The eagle had been plucked clean, wings broken, talons shattered. At the absolute peak of despair, every monitor suddenly went black. Then a crystal clear live feed appeared from an unidentified conference room on the Eurasian continent. The supreme representatives of the Moscow-Beijing-Tehran axis sat calmly in crisp suits, staring like predators at caged beasts. A cold, merciless countdown beep began. A quantum AI translated message rang through the bunker. Mr. President, our intercept systems have locked targets. Our nuclear submarines are in position. Your 127 warships no longer exist. Your power grid and nuclear command are in our hands. The 30-second countdown begins. Unconditional surrender and total withdrawal from Asia and Europe, or watch 300 million Americans vaporize. The decision is yours. 30 eternal seconds gnawed at every nerve. The hand of the once all-powerful commander-in-chief trembled violently over the nuclear football. Sweat poured down his ashen face. Four-star generals stood like melting wax statues, their eyes filled with primal terror. At the 5th second before zero, with a heavy, brain-numbing sigh that collapsed a century of pride, the president's hand dropped. He buried his face in his hands and issued the order to surrender in a hoarse, broken voice. The unipolar world order had officially shattered. America had blinked. The instant surrender was confirmed. Humiliating scenes unfolded across the globe. In the Strait of Hormuz, surviving U.S. Marines raised trembling white hands and were herded like prisoners onto Iranian boats while the broken hulls of Nimitz-class carriers sank behind them. The burned stars and stripes swirled in the oily waves, eternal monuments to imperial arrogance. Israel was isolated and forced to sign painful territorial concessions. In the Pacific, U.S. bases raised white flags. Taiwan reintegrated without resistance. Europe abandoned America completely, lifted sanctions, and knelt before the new Eastern Order in rubles and yuan. The greatest blow came on the financial front. The BRICS system fully activated, the dollar was dumped worldwide. Hyperinflation and chaos consumed America. The empire that once starved nations with sanctions now choked in its own cage of hyperinflation, debt, and street violence. America was locked inside its borders, a darkened, divided continent cast out of history. The Russia-China-Iran axis had performed major surgery, excising the tumor of Western hegemony from the world. History is a cold, merciless judge. Hegemony never lasts forever. The delusion of power and reckless arrogance ultimately dug the West's own grave. Through superior strategy, deception, and asymmetric warfare, the Eastern Axis turned America's proud fleet into scrap and delivered a death blow into its nuclear heart. The North American eagle folded its wings, lost its fangs, and fell in the most humiliating disgrace in history. A new dawn of the multipolar world order has risen from the sea of fire, blood, and tears. For Washington, it is the beginning of a long, dark, cold, lonely night with no end in sight. Thank you for staying with us through this brutal, epic saga. If you felt the raw pressure of global power games, leave your thoughts in the comments, like, share, and subscribe. The multipolar era has begun, and conflict will never sleep. See you at the next global hotspots.